Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast, where we answer
Dan and Justin.
Dan and Justin,
where we
answer questions
about the Bible with
questionable answers.
Nailed it. Dan, this week I think we're in Genesis 6.
We are.
We're talking about the flood. Is that correct?
It's true. We just finished talking about the Nephilim last week, so we're going to go on to the flood.
How much of the flood do you think we'll be able to cover this hour?
Well, hopefully all of it, because I have things that are beyond the flood to talk about too.
All right, we're going to try to get through as much of the flood as we can this week. If not, it's going to be a 2-part series, it looks like.
Just like all of them.
I know, right?
All right.
There's a never-ending list of questions, but we'll narrow down to the most important ones.
Yep. All right, so before we get into the verses about the flood, I was just wondering, just overall about the flood, is it possible this is just a biblical explanation for the other flood myths that people in that time believed were true, like Gilgamesh, and I presume there are others? I mean, I feel like there have been flood myths all around the world, maybe, and of course, there's one thing, where it's like, well, they all had to have an origin. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'm aware of a couple flood myths. I think just about every culture has a flood myth. Mm-hmm. But the ones that are relevant to this one are from Sumer. That's the Eridu flood myth. And then there's one from Babylon, the Atra-Hasis.
You say that because those are the only ones the Israelites would have been aware of, right?
It is most likely these are the ones that the Israelites would have known about. They were pretty widely circulated. And then there was one that was integrated into the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
And then we have the biblical flood narrative, and we have actually a Greek retelling of some of the Babylonian flood myth from Berosus. And then there are other flood myths beyond that from the region, but I think it might be overkill to sample all of them. Mm-hmm. I think it might be worthwhile to look at some of them, though.
Which says how many there are.
Right.
And so I always think there are two schools of thought. One, since there are flood myths all over the place, that must mean there was an actual flood. And two, since they're all over the place, they must have just copied each other because somebody thought the flood was true, and everybody else is like, well, we better add it to our history,
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point.
Yeah.
It seems most likely that if a historical event is tested by many, many cultures over a long duration of time, there's probably at least a kernel of truth, right?
Yes, I would think so.
Right. And I think it's fair to say that something happened. If if you're like a biblical minimalist, you might say it's completely made up, or it was a very, very minor incident, and then it just became bigger and bigger over time. Mm-hmm. But being that all of the ancient Near Eastern cultures share a similar flood myth, I think we would be doing an injustice by assuming that the flood didn't happen. I think we have to assume there was some level of flooding. The question is, what can we prove from a historical and archaeological standpoint?
Well, that's definitely the question. I was always taught that there was actual proof of the flood, like water levels.
Sure,
that's a thing.
It is a thing.
Yeah. See,
water levels where?
On things, rocks.
Sure.
Like canyons, what have you. I mean, there's proof that the water was once a lot higher. How's that?
Like in the Grand Canyon, right? Do you think that the water level marks in the Grand Canyon could be explained by anything else?
I bet they can, because you're going to tell me. So,
I think most people would assume that the water level marks in the Grand Canyon were most likely due to the water that resided within the Grand Canyon for a long period of time.
Yeah, like the flood, you mean?
Well, it doesn't have to be from a giant flood. Could be from the body of water that feeds into it. Maybe from glacier melting.
The Grand Canyon is pretty large, though.
Oh, it's big.
That would take a lot of water.
Well, the glaciers formed a large part of the Mediterranean and Black Sea, and a lot of what we would have in the Great Lakes were all from glacier movement southward. And then you'll see a lot of lakes in Canada that are glacier related. So these are big bodies of water.
I get that, but the Grand Canyon it's pretty grand.
Well, have you seen Lake Superior? Lake Michigan? They're very large lakes. You can't see to the other side of them.
I've seen Lake Erie.
But you can't see to the other side of Lake Erie either. But you can see across the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you. Do you think if it had flooded for, let's say, 40 days or 100 days or whatever, would that have been long enough for there to be a noticeable water level difference? Because these things usually have to stay there for a while, don't they? You know what I'm saying?
I think so. Yeah. So there's a really interesting hypothesis as to how the myth arose.
Okay.
Arisen.
Arose.
Yeah. The Black Sea hypothesis. So the Black Sea, it was discovered some time ago that the water level in the Black Sea was significantly lower than what it is today. And there are remnants of ancient settlements that are, if the Black Sea is this big now, and there's a settlement that comes around the outside of it, and then say 1,000 years from now, there's a flood event, and now the Black Sea is this big. You could theoretically go underwater and find the old settlements that used to be around the perimeter of the smaller size of the Black Sea. And that's exactly what we've discovered in the Black Sea, is that there are at least some partial settlements from humanity that would lead us to believe that there was a really catastrophic flood during at least time portion, maybe 5,000 BC.
I mean, where is this sea located?
The Black Sea is just north of Turkey.
So is that near the Israelites or what have you? Because, I mean, I find it hard to believe all civilizations would have a flood myth based on just one localized flood, right?
Yeah, well, localized would be a very difficult a very difficult explanation, because local is only local to how big of a region group. It's local to people who have information. So if I said a local grocery store, you know that there's 10, 15 local grocery stores in the area. And that's within a mile or two, a couple miles.
Yeah.
So you would assume that a local grocery store is nearby. If I said a local city, well, now that could be 10, 15, 20 miles out. So to say that the flood was local to a region is hard to define. How big of a region are we referring to?
Do the Chinese have a flood myth?
They do.
Well, obviously they're pretty far away from the Black Sea, right?
Right.
I rest my case.
That's a great point. So one of the questions I would ask is it possible that there were multiple flood events and that these were not all stemming from one flood event? And the reason why I would ask that is because if we assume that there was a flood event in the Black Sea region that stretched through the greater area where the Tigris and Euphrates rested, or even there's an alternative theory that water pushed in from the Persian Gulf up through the Fertile Crescent where the Tigris and Euphrates typically flooded. The theory is that the Fertile Crescent would be able to flood significant enough that it would displace 100, 200,000 people, even more than that. So I guess the question would be, if that flood is possible, is it possible that there were other floods in ancient times?
I mean, there's floods in current times. So yeah, I presume there were floods back then. What you're basically saying, though, is that there were localized floods, but no one like in the Bible.
I think from a scientific standpoint, we can definitively prove that there were many localized floods throughout the many populations of the world. But I see no proof that a biblical style up to the mountaintops global flood had ever existed. And I think that there are a couple things that need to be explained if so. So one of the things would be, well, where did the water go to? If the water was on the earth, where did it go now? it didn't evaporate into space, we assume. That's not really how evaporation works. Even if it had evaporated, the gravity from the Earth would have pulled it back into the atmosphere.
I suppose we can't just say it was miraculous, right?
Well, I think that's certainly a possibility, right? But that brings up
Yeah.
another question, right? If God is going to create a number of miracles to have the flood be possible,
Yeah.
well, it seems to me that he also could have just snapped his fingers
Right.
and wiped out the population without having to drown them all,
Right, yeah.
right?
I mean, it does seem like outside of, let's say, Jesus' miracles, I feel like God usually does like to use the laws of physics, right? Or at least they're explainable by that, you know?
Yeah.
I found.
Or at least like when we talk about the plagues in Egypt.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one.
I mean, there are actual
Don't
geological and scientific explanations on how these plagues
Don't ruin it.
could have actually happened.
It's a really good one, though. We talked about that one.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, let's continue.
Right. I mean, so anyways, the Black Sea at roughly 5,000 BC, we've got lots of proof that the Black Sea region flooded in a very, very large way and displaced a lot of people. And so I think it would be certainly a great source of a flood narrative. That flood narrative would have affected all the people of Anatolia, the Hittite people. It would have affected people in the Levant, in the Fertile Crescent, so Mesopotamia, Babylon, Akkad, and similar floods, most likely, I would have assumed would occur near Egypt, or at least Egypt would have known about the Black Sea flood, because the displaced people from the Black Sea would have ended up probably in the Egyptian kingdom looking for refuge. So I say all that, I don't want to have a whole episode just on the archaeology of the Black Sea flood.
Yeah.
But it certainly is, I think, the most plausible hypothesis of how the region flooded. And it would have flooded in a large enough way in which so many people would have been displaced that they would have assumed that the whole world had flooded. And if you look at like the Babylonian map of the world, the Babylonian map of the world really only encompasses Babylon, Sumer, Egypt, the Levant, the Hittite territories, and not much more than that. So according to the people at the time, they were unaware that there were populations up in China. They were unaware that there were populations on the other side of the Mediterranean for a long time. And even going down into Africa, they were aware that Egypt was populated, but they weren't fully aware of the populations that were to the south or to the west of Egypt. So if that's your concept of the world, is this small place, and that small place floods, well, guess what? The whole world is flooded.
And then they needed a reason for that to happen, so they made up the Noah myth.
Right. Yeah, the reason. We need to talk about the reason. So the reasoning in the Bible is essentially the sinfulness of the human race.
Right.
And the defilement of all of their hearts and perhaps even of the land itself, right? But we see in ancient Babylon, in the Akkadian Empire, and in Sumer, these were very different reasons for the flood. So, for example, in the old Babylonian myths, the gods basically created humankind to do the drudgery and the toiling on the earth to produce food and crop, and then their task was to feed and service the deities.
Okay.
Right? But when the population expanded, there was a lot of noise and racket and complaining from these human beings. And the method of dealing with it was to flood the earth and wipe them out. And if it wasn't for, I believe, Enki giving secret information to mankind, then there would be nobody saved from the flood. So both in the Eridu Genesis story and the Atra-Hasis story of the flood, it's basically the noise and the racket from mankind that make the flood a desirable situation. But after the flood, when the gods realized they acted in haste and anger, they were actually pleased with Enki, that he was able to preserve a portion of mankind so that they could continue with the care of the deities, right? Because they still wanted to be fed.
Mm-hmm.
So the reasoning is quite different. I think it seems to me, at least, that the biblical reasoning is an argument against the Babylonian reasoning,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Trying to show how that's not really how it happened. This is how it actually happened.
That's a lot of Genesis, right?
It seems
It's
that
just
way.
trying to, take the old myths and say that, their God did it all.
Right. Or, this is what happened, but here's actually the way the story should be told, or here's what really happened. So we'll say the biblical narrative certainly seems to be attempting to correct the record, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. And I think from a biblical standpoint, there's a lot of corrections that seem to make sense. So for example, in the Babylonian and the Sumerian myths, it seems very confusing that the deities would be so ignorant and capricious and just kind of really flimsy in how they're acting and feeling, and then they're creating humankind, and then the next day they wipe them out, and it's then they realize they shouldn't have wiped them out, and they seem to be not so godly.
Mm-hmm.
They appear no better than the dumb humans.
Right.
But in the biblical narrative, it seems that it's a completely different situation. God doesn't really want to wipe out the humans.
Yeah.
He seems to have affection and affinity for the humans.
He has to.
It's only because the humans have become completely defiled and completely sinful that it seems like, well, this is the only way to preserve humanity, is to wipe out all of the sinful humans and only preserve the remnant that are righteous. And that remnant, of course, is Noah and his family.
Of course.
Right.
Here's a question. Does Noah have any significance, the name?
That's actually a really great question, and the answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a hint in chapter 5, actually. Lamech lived 182 years and fathered a son. He called his name Noah, commenting, "May this one bring us relief from our work and from the pain of our hands, because the land which the Lord has cursed." I think I read that wrong. "May this one bring us relief from our work and from the pain of our hands, because the land which the Lord has cursed." That is just a terrible wording. I actually read it correctly.
Yeah.
Terrible translation. Lamech lived 595 years. After he had fathered Noah, fathering sons and daughters, Lamech's whole life lasted 777 years, and he died. Noah was 500 years old when he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But on the meaning of Noah's name,
Right.
I'm pretty sure it's referring to rest.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's seen in chapter 5, where he's given his name because he is the one that's going to bring relief from the work.
Resting in peace.
Right. And now here's what's interesting.
Yeah.
In the Babylonian narratives, who is it that wants relief from the work and wants rest?
The gods?
Yeah, the gods are the ones that want relief.
Yeah.
And that becomes the cause of the flood. But here in the biblical narrative, it's actually the human beings that seem to want the rest and the relief. But they won't be getting it.
Right, they're going to be dying.
Yeah, they're going to get wiped out.
So, yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
About the flood, logistically speaking.
Right.
Other than the fact that God could have just smitten all living creatures, as opposed to flooding the whole region, globe. It seems to be the reasoning for the flood is the sinfulness of mankind, but what sin did the animals commit?
Well, I'll say two things. One, it's possible that this is some sort of, an offering given to God, right?
Oh, interesting.
And two, since animals don't have souls, doesn't it really matter?
Right.
No offense to them or anything.
I think this is a good question. Do the animals should they be treated as though they matter? Are they no different than the plants, than the trees?
I mean, they're different, but one human life would outweigh thousands of animals.
Right.
So.
Right, yeah. I can't disagree that the value of a human life would be different than the value of, say, your dog.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. I had another question coming into this. The Lord saw the wickedness of humans, that it was great, that every inclination and the thoughts of their hearts were only evil continually. And then it says, the Lord was sorry that he made humans on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. One of the confusing parts about this, and it comes up often, is, if God is all-knowing, could he have not known that this was the inevitable outcome? And if that's the case, why was he grieved in his heart if he knew or could have known that this was obviously going to happen?
Are we talking about it like this actually happened, or like it was a literary device?
If we take the biblical story at face value,
okay,
it seems confusing to me.
Right.
Now we're looking from a Christian perspective. I don't think this story was written from a Christian perspective, and I think it makes sense reading it from an ancient Near Eastern mindset, where the deities weren't all knowing and weren't in all places at once.
Right.
They were limited to a geographical region, and they were limited to a people group, typically, and they had limited powers, and they could even get tired. Right. But if we take the New Testament perspective, it seems very confusing to me that, especially if you're Calvinist and you believe in predestination, how cruel it would be for God to create humanity full well knowing that he was going to have to wipe millions of them off the map because that they were sinful, when in fact he theoretically created them to be sinful.
Yeah.
And the outcome seems to have been inevitable. And why would he make them to be sinful creatures if he has the ability to make them not sinful? And the question comes up often, God wants a genuine relationship with humanity, right? So free will is a requirement. You can't love somebody if you don't have free will. You can't be in a real relationship without real decision making. But we do see, in the end, there's going to be a new heaven and new earth, and there's not going to be sin or pain or strife, and the lion is going to lay down with the lamb, so on and so forth. And the idyllic, perspective of heaven seems to be that all of the wrongs in the world are going to be righted, but not because of anything we did.
Right.
But because of something God's going to do.
So why didn't he just get it right the first time?
Right. So why not get it right the first time?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
If it's possible to get it right, why would it not just happen the first time?
I have no idea.
Neither do I.
That's why the only way I can read this is from a different point of view, because it doesn't really make sense at face value.
Right. I think for me, the Noah story was one of the reasons, even as an early Christian, I always thought that, say, like open theism made more sense. That God had created mankind with a free will, not actually knowing what the outcome was going to be, but still interacting and loving mankind and choosing to use mankind to accomplish his purpose.
I mean, if God wanted to not know something, he could do that because he can do anything, right?
He could. Like, imagine he's all-knowing, all-powerful. Is it possible he can make something in which he doesn't know?
I mean, the answer is yes, of course.
Right.
But that's it. You know, it's like, can he make a boulder too heavy for him to lift? The answer is yes, and then he'll lift it.
Right. Yeah. So we have a not hypothesis. What's the word I'm looking for?
I guess.
Paradox.
That's it.
Not even close. We have a paradox here.
Yeah.
Where it would seem as though if we take the New Testament perspective, it's very, very difficult to understand why God would wipe out humanity. Right. Or why he just wouldn't do it right the first time. Yeah. The last part about, we'll say, the reasoning and some of the moral issues with the flood story is, and this comes up with the conquest of Canaan too.
Comes up a lot.
Is if mankind has been judged because of their sinfulness, what does that mean for babies, infants, small children who don't have necessarily the capacity for evil?
Well, I can give you a very uncaring, unfeeling reason if you want.
Sure.
Just like with the animals, is it possible that killing babies is not that wrong? I mean, I think in the Bible it mentions something about it, a coming of age, some point where you are responsible for your own sins.
I'm unaware of this.
Then it probably isn't in there. But but yeah, I thought somewhere in the Bible it said like you get to an age where you are responsible for your own actions, but before then you aren't.
I think the Jewish position has always been that you become a man or a woman at roughly the age of 13. And I think in Western society we tend to keep that tradition, where we assume that anyone under, say, the teenage years are roughly less accountable for their actions than somebody who would be past their teenagers.
And I mean, these children, I mean, I assume they just all go to heaven immediately.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great question, is what became of the people that died in the flood?
Yes, what did become of them?
Right. Now, the interesting thing is that from a New Testament perspective, like if you read through Thessalonians, it seems to be that those who had, quote unquote, fallen asleep before Jesus, those that were righteous, will be brought to renewed life. So that brings up a lot of complications for the New Testament message, how you could achieve salvation before the time of Jesus. But we're going to get there at a much later point.
Much later.
The question becomes, something has to have become of those people. Yeah. Right? And so does that, if you're below the age of accountability, you're not old enough.
The age of accountability, that's it.
Right.
That's what I wanted to say.
If you're not old enough to be held accountable.
Is that in the Bible anywhere?
No.
Nowhere.
No, it's not a thing.
I'll have to look into it then.
I mean, in the Bible, you can actually murder your own children for being disobedient.
Oh, that's okay.
So there's some accountability there, right?
A little bit.
It would seem that even children are to be held accountable. And remember the children that were mauled by the bears for making fun of Elisha's bald spot?
Yeah, we'll get into that.
That's some really fun accountability. And I assume they were young.
Right, yeah.
Right. So there's probably, there's enough, there are enough passages in the Bible we can probably come up with a theology of accountability. But there's enough passages in the Bible where we could also probably do the opposite. And there's a lot of passages in the Bible where children and babies, even the unborn, are punished for the sins of their parents or from their parents' parents, and so on and so forth. So it would seem that the value of life in the Old Testament is not the same as what we would value today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even just in the Old Testament. I mean, just back in the old days. I mean, if you didn't want a child, you would put him in the sun and let him die of exposure.
Very common.
I mean, this is true.
Oh yeah, throughout the Roman Empire, this was a very, very common practice. A lot of prostitutes had ways of ending pregnancies early or not getting pregnant at all, but a lot of them also just set the babies out for exposure.
Yeah.
And in fact, they had regions in town where we would say there was a collective of babies that were left for exposure. Like there was a place where you could take your baby to let them die of exposure.
That's terrible.
Could you imagine living in a society where there was, okay, if you go to, South Street, on such and such corner, here's the place where you dump your baby.
I don't know. That gets into pro-life issues right there. So
right, but to your question, are those babies in heaven now?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Either they're in heaven or they're waiting for the end of days to get into heaven. Right.
I can't disagree with that. That seems to be the most probable theological outcome for this particular quandary. Mm-hmm. But it's also not something that is heavily addressed in the scriptures. There's little to go on. Yeah. All right, let's move into the next question.
All right, we got 6:14 to 16. This is about the construction of the ark.
Sure.
One question before we get into anything. Are cubits an actual measurement?
Yeah.
Okay, I've never heard of them.
It's roughly from the base of your palm to your elbow. So anywhere between 12 and 16 inches typically.
And this is attested somewhere? Like this is a measurement.
Yeah. The cubit is actually attested to in ancient literature and documents.
Okay.
So we know that this was a pretty widely used practice.
Okay.
Even though it wasn't as accurate as some other methods of measuring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So along those lines, so they were pretty meticulous instructions. I mean, it wasn't just, hey, make an ark. But I mean, he talked about, how much wood, the pitch, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So the question is, could it actually make a seaworthy vessel? And, why would they include the instructions if it didn't work? Which is to say, if this isn't true, and somebody just wrote this as a story, they either just made it up, which wouldn't make sense because everybody would know they made it up, or this actually does make an ark. And if it does make an ark, then why did they go through all that trouble? I mean, obviously, maybe, people would know if the instructions were bad or not.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple questions that we could ask about that, and that is if these instructions were given for a vessel, would they be testable in ancient times? Okay. So if you read these instructions, say you're reading this story 500 years after the fact, and you read these measurements, are you able to build a boat to those measurements and try it out for yourself? And I think from history, we can see that most of even the large vessels struggled to get anywhere close to the size of the ark. Now that doesn't mean that it would have been impossible to build the ark. Of course, it certainly could have been possible, and it certainly could have been seafaring. It could have been perfectly buoyant. There have been people who have done computer models and created an ark on a computer model, and they've been able to float and also to carry the weight of many, many animals based on like rough guesstimates of how many animals would have been in there. So I think...
So it's realistic then?
I think it's possible. I don't know, unless we went out and built one according to the specifications, we can know for sure. But
surely somebody's done that, right?
I mean, people have tried.
And have failed?
Well,
I know it's hard, but
yeah,
got to be somebody out there, a billionaire, who wants to try it out.
I mean, people have built them to scale.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've taken the measurements and built smaller versions.
Yeah.
And they've been perfectly fine.
Right, yeah.
But it would seem to me, as long as the vessel was sound, it would at least float. But will it stay upright? Will it handle the waves?
Right,
Will it handle
yeah.
the storms? Well, I don't know. I think a lot of people question whether or not the ark would even float. I think the question is obviously yes, but there are deeper issues like, could it withstand the storms? You know, could it, you know, what was the mechanism in which the animals were able to defecate aboard the ark for over a year?
Yeah.
Just over a year, like a year and a week. How did they defecate for that entire time, and in which way did they deal with all of the feces?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I
Right.
mean, think about just your dog. You got to walk your dog once, twice, sometimes 3 times a day, and then clean up their poop.
Right.
Yeah. Imagine for all the poop you've cleaned up your dog for an
how many
entire
people were
year.
there? 6 people or something?
I want to say there was 8.
1, 2, 3, 4. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There was 6, right?
Noah,
Oh, and
Noah's
his
wife,
7.
3 children and their wives, right? All the children had wives.
Yeah. 8.
Yeah. I mean, they could have
Still.
had more wives. I don't know. Maybe some of the kids had multiple wives, and we just don't know about it.
Yeah.
For the Bible. Anyways,
I just want to mention, you know, the Titanic.
Sure.
It's almost twice as long as the Ark,
Oh, I believe that.
and it's wider,
Mhm.
it's taller.
Mhm.
The point is, we could definitely make an Ark.
Oh, today you mean?
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
we've already surpassed it.
Well, I think today we could. I mean, have you seen the Carnival cruise lines?
Yeah.
It's like 4 Titanics.
Yeah.
I mean, they're floating cities nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think the question is, what was the capability of the people in 5000 BC?
Right.
Yeah.
What's the answer?
They were pretty capable, but even, we'll say, in the reign of King David and Solomon,
Mm-hmm.
it was common for Egyptian boats to send large cedar trees from Lebanon down to Egypt,
Okay.
across the Mediterranean. Some of these cedars were 100, 200 feet tall. So they would fell these cedar trees and then trim them and ship them, the cords of wood. So if they've got boats during the time of King David that can
Right.
ship, the cedar wood, which is pretty heavy,
Mm-hmm.
my guess is, couple thousand years before that, they probably were able to make some pretty competent vessels.
I got to be honest with you. I really thought you were going to say, "Oh no, the Ark could never happen. This was just a story."
I mean, there's a lot of history of making sea vessels. It seems to me though, if I had to guess, the time period that we're talking about, I think is roughly, 4,000 or 5,000 BC,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think the capabilities and the size of the ark, when it's described, fit the Middle Bronze Age, which is probably when this story was written down and recorded.
Okay.
And so I think the actual measurements of the ark, say for example, the Black Sea flood myth, where going back to that, say for
Right.
example, someone did survive that by building a large boat.
Yeah.
And maybe they even did think it was global and they threw a bunch of animals on board.
Yeah. Well,
What size would that boat be? I would imagine it would be pretty small.
the size of the Ark?
Maybe half.
Why is that?
I just don't think they had the vessel making abilities at that time period. I mean, this is a time period where agriculture was still new.
Yeah, but you just said they made boats that.
They were still learning to make plows.
So, at the era of King David, that was.
By King David's time, making large wooden vessels was commonplace.
Yeah, but not back in this day.
No, at Noah's time, according to the history of the Bible, at Noah's time, really, really large vessels were not common.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that this passage was written much later, like in King David's era when they actually knew how they would make it.
Yeah, I think the passage is pretty ancient, but I think a lot of the details were from much later. And in fact, I think the details that we read currently in the version we have are a combination of writers from maybe as old as the United Monarchy, so David's time, but probably even more so from the priestly editors that came perhaps even in the Babylonian era.
So it's not that surprising that they got these instructions right, because when they were writing it, they would have actually known how to make it.
I think so.
That's not good.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think the instructions for the ark were an interpretive feature of the story.
Hey, let me ask you. All right, so we're going with the Black Sea theory. So that does not cover the whole world. It just covers a small portion. Is it possible that they'd only need to take the animals in that general vicinity? Yeah. Instead of every single animal in existence?
Right.
I mean, that would be a lot less animals, probably.
Imagine for a second, because first of all, the flood, they say it was a global flood, but most likely regional.
Right.
The animals they brought on the ark, they said was 2. Unless you read the whole story, then it's also 7 of the clean animals.
Right.
There seems to be some discrepancies, both in the animals and the time period, how many days. But if the flood was regional and exaggerated to global, then perhaps the animals were also regional, but exaggerated to global.
I mean, it's not even exaggerated if they actually believed it, right?
Right. Yeah, they weren't making things up. This was their reality.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good point just for a half a second to think on, because it's really easy to read the stories and think, well, this is all just made up. But you have to imagine at the time this was written, these were hard facts that people thought they knew and understood. Not necessarily stuff that people just made up off the top of their head.
Right.
There were gaps in their quote-unquote knowledge, and they filled some of those gaps in with information they had at the time just for explanatory power, not knowing thousands of years later that would be called into question.
Right.
So, yeah.
So is the truth when they wrote it.
Yeah, and no one could tell them otherwise because they didn't know any better.
Yeah.
All right, let's discuss briefly the issue that has come up already in Genesis, which is the doubling of stories. Like the 2 accounts of creation in Genesis that seem to be competing, or various doublets. Can you introduce us to that particular issue, Dan?
Sure can.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're looking at yet another flood story that conflicts with the first one. Also, they used the number 7 a lot, which was clearly symbolic. I doubt everything really was 7s all over the place. We know that 7 is a divine number. It's a number for God, right?
Well, we would say it's God's number. I don't know if we would say it represents God, though.
Oh.
If that makes sense.
It really doesn't. So it seemed like I said the same thing.
Yeah.
So since it's clearly symbolism to a degree where I think it's obvious even back then, why would they do something so obviously not real? You know? Is it possible they were not even going for realism?
With the story?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, and that's the confusing part. So we talk about, briefly you mentioned in 7:2, it seems to be a retelling of the same narrative we just kind of touched on in chapter 6.
Yeah.
It starts out, then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, and you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs, so on and so forth. It seems to be retelling a bunch of parts that we just read. What's the point?
At least the creation stories,
right?
They weren't so much in conflict as they were just adding on to each other. And these feel like they're actually different.
Right.
You know?
Right. They feel so. What is most commonly viewed for the flood narrative is that there was 3 versions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The first version was the Yahwist version, and then the Elohist version, and then the last was the priestly version. And the priestly class are the ones that get credited with weaving all 3 of these into a single narrative.
Okay.
And in what appears to be an attempt to not lose portions of the previous versions, they wanted to include as much material as possible. They kept as much as they could of the old and tried to weave them into a patchwork. But
even if it didn't make sense?
Even if it seems to have doublets, even if it seems to have contradictory information. For example, it flooded for 40 days and 40 nights, but then also for 150 days. And then also they were on the ark for an entire year, even though it wasn't supposed to be for a whole year.
Now, is this because they didn't know which one was real and so they just wanted to hedge their bets? Or is it because each class, if you will, the North and the South, right? They had their own versions of the Bible, and they wanted to make everybody happy, you know?
That's a great point, because, and this brings up a really interesting issue, is if you're used to hearing something like a sacred history, and you combine it with a similar sacred history,
right?
You can probably get away with that. But if you start cutting parts out, people who know the story, they're going to lose their mind. And a very interesting story happened to a friend of mine who's a pastor, Pastor Mike, and he worked for a Presbyterian church, and he noticed a really big problem almost immediately after working at the church. Okay. And that is, in the nave of the church, the altar was in a very inconvenient location. It seemed to always be in the way of trying to utilize the space up front. And so he asked somebody in the church, one of the elders, if he moved the altar, what kind of repercussions would there be? Would that cause a problem for anybody? And he was actually informed that the previous pastor nearly got fired over moving the altar, because the previous pastor knew that the altar was in an inconvenient location too. It was problematic for holding the service. And so he moved it one day, and people left the church. People literally quit the church because the altar got moved at the church. So Pastor Mike, and this is no exaggeration, he moved it 1 inch a month. He would move it 1 inch every month until he got it to the location where he wanted it. And almost nobody noticed until it was way too late, and people their memories couldn't recall where it had been.
It was pretty clever, actually.
And so people really have a tendency to make things sacred when they've heard it or seen it long enough. Yeah. Just like at a Lutheran church, I knew someone who always wore the robes. And one day he decided, I'm no longer wearing robes, I'm wearing a suit. Yeah. And people left the church because he didn't want to wear the robes anymore. Right. So I think what you're suggesting makes perfect sense. I think as an editor, you want to keep as much of the historic material as possible together, even if that means maybe the story doesn't fit together well. Right. Mm-hmm. Because the consequence of removing it means, well, you've lost people. Mm-hmm. And what's the whole point in joining all this material together to begin with anyways?
Right. To join everybody together.
To join all the people groups. Yeah. The North and the South, the Israelites and the Judites and the Benjamites, try to get them all together in a united kingdom. Right. So that's a very good observation. It also explains the conflicts within the story.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. I mean, the conflicts are still unfortunate because I know a lot of people believe that this is, inerrant. Right. And how can you have an inerrant, God-breathed Bible when there are inconsistencies within it?
Right. Well, of course, some people would suggest the original manuscripts are inerrant. What we have currently today is not, but the original manuscripts were. What do you think about that?
The ones before they were compiled, you mean?
They're originals. The ones that were uttered by God and very first written down.
Oh, well, you'd have to believe that God told people what to write, huh?
Right.
Which I mean, I guess that's true. A lot of people do believe that. God told, like, say, Moses how he was going to die, for instance.
Right.
And so he wrote it down.
Right.
I'm not sure I, believe in that theory, personally. You know.
Yeah.
I know we talk a lot about how human error comes into play. And then we ask ourselves, would God have intervened? Or would he have let it happen?
I think one of the questions I have about the original manuscripts question is not whether or not they could have been perfect or whether or not they could have been without error, but whether or not the question's even worth asking since we don't have them.
It's always worth asking, I think, I mean, that's a question people are going to want to know the answer to.
Right. But since there's no way to prove it, does it seem like an unfair question to even pose?
No.
Oh, interesting.
No, I mean, you still want an answer even if you can't find one. That's obvious. And, even more questions will lead to more questions to lead to more answers,
Right. So the human instinct to satisfy the curiosity seems to reign supreme?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that. I hadn't considered that yet. Do we have any other things we want to hit this week before we jump into the real deep details of the flood story, some of the contradictions, some of the stuff that Noah gets up to after the flood?
All right. There's one thing I want to bring up on probably a lighter side. Is it possible the flood is how the dinosaurs died?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's 100% possible.
Okay.
And it also explains why the aquatic animals seem to have survived. So we have remnants of that, like alligators,
right,
crocodiles, other types of reptiles. And also we had birds that survived.
That's right, yeah.
And because birds are the ancient ancestors of the dinosaurs, right?
Right, yeah.
So it would seem that the animals that are able to survive a flood, at least if it was a temporary flood, not for a full year maybe, that some of them survived.
But then it would probably have to be a worldwide thing, or the dinosaurs were only on this one area by the Black Sea.
Right. So the dinosaur theory makes sense if you are of the assumption that it was global. So it had to be a global flood to wipe out the dinosaurs, or else there must have been more than one catastrophe. Maybe the flood accounted for some dinosaurs, and then also a meteor or volcano for other dinosaurs, or global warming for others. Or
is it possible that God created dinosaurs and humans, and then he's like, you know what, this isn't working out. The dinosaurs are killing all the humans. I need to kill them.
I think I think if you created dinosaurs and humans to live together,
right,
you would rather immediately see that it was a bad idea.
Yeah.
But from what we have from archaeology, it would appear that the dinosaurs died out way, way before humans ever even were a twinkling in God's eye. So one of the questions you might ask is, well, maybe there were two creations. Maybe God created the dinosaurs first and said, there's way too much carnage. I don't know if this is really what I'm looking for.
Right.
And then said, no, I'll make human beings in our image.
Yeah, so why did he make dinosaurs? That will never make sense, right?
Were the dinosaurs just a trial?
Yeah. Does he need a trial? He's God.
Well, maybe God was more like a Roman emperor and he just wanted some blood sport first. And then he said, okay, I think I've had my fill.
We're going to cut that one out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to.
All right, listen, you said that dinosaurs, it was shown that they were dead long before humans came on the scene. Now, you're saying that because of what, carbon dating?
Oh, no, there's lots of ways we date. I mean, carbon dating was the first, would say, a tried and true method of dating things.
Yeah, but we've now found that carbon dating is not always reliable. right?
Well, no. Carbon dating is quite reliable up to a particular date range.
Right. Yeah.
Once you get beyond a particular date range, it becomes much more difficult to carbon date.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lots of other dating methods, and let's run through a couple of them. All right, so the popular methods for dating, we'll just run through a couple of them and then give a brief overview. The radiometric carbon dating is the most popular. That's measuring the rate of decay in the carbon-14 molecule, and that is really accurate up to roughly 50,000 years in the past. Almost as popular as potassium argon dating, and this is much more common when trying to date something that's, say, millions or hundreds of thousands of years old. It runs on a similar principle to the carbon-14 dating. Another popular method is thermoluminescence. So this dating is based on how objects are absorbing heat. So the technique is based on the principle that all objects absorb radiation from the environment. So the process frees electrons within minerals that remain caught within the item. Heating an item to 500 degrees Celsius or higher releases the trapped electrons, producing light. This light can be measured to determine the last time the item was heated. Radiation levels do not remain constant over time. Fluctuating levels can skew results. There's also optically stimulated luminescence, and this dating constraints the time at which sediment was last exposed to light. Then there's dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, and also amino acid dating, which is for organic dating. But the one in particular for the dinosaurs that we probably would want to consider is the potassium argon dating. The half-life of potassium-40 is roughly 1.3 billion years, which means the dating of the decay.
No, we don't actually know that, right? Since nobody's been around for 1.3 billion years.
Well, no, we can only measure that out based on current rates of decay. So, for example, if we have something that can reliably be measured at say 500 years old, and then 1,000 years old, and 1,500 years old.
Yeah, but we also don't know if, like, at 50,000 years old, it just accelerates rapidly or anything like that, right?
Well, yeah, we actually there are curves for the rate of decay on these items. Okay. So the easiest curve to observe is carbon-14. That's been really widely studied, so you can see the rate of decay in the curve. And then the same is true for potassium argon, but to a lesser extent. So we can determine a rate of decay and calculate mathematically, say, what that rate of decay has been over the provable history.
I'm just saying it could be wrong, though, right?
Anything could be wrong.
You know, I mean, if you don't have provable history.
Right. So the question becomes, is there something that could affect the rate of decay so that it would be changing at a rate that is no longer consistent with what we are measuring in the modern era? And certainly that's been brought up with carbon-14 dating, because it seems to me that items that have been heavily, say, waterlogged or damaged by very long periods of contact with running water,
like a flood,
their rate of decay has been observed to be accelerated to a small amount. But certainly there are elements from the items that are in contact with the material that can affect the rate of decay. And then certainly one might ask, well, would something like a volcanic eruption or geothermal activity, could those affect the rate of decay of these items? And I think that's where the potassium argon dating becomes really helpful. So the potassium argon dating doesn't seem to have any, well, at least not the same deficiencies that we see in carbon-14 dating, where the rate of decay can be drastically affected by the environment. So it's just more stable, which is of course why the half-life is over 1 billion years old. It's a very stable, it's a very stable molecule, very easy to create a curve.
Mm-hmm. I get you.
So yeah, and there are other ways too. Obviously, tree rings and ice cores have been helpful for measuring things, even up to tens of thousands of years old. So, if we can create a carbon-14 decay curve based on some of these known dates, using tree rings, using ancient cultures that we knew were around, and using ice cores and things of that nature, it seemed that we could at least be reasonably accurate with dating human beings to be 10, 15, 20,000 years old. Whether or not we could date the dinosaurs would be different. But back to the question at hand, can we know that dinosaurs lived millions of years before the humans? I think the answer to that is yeah, because that would turn up. We would see that in the carbon-14 dating. We would see that they were recent.
What if I told you I don't believe dinosaurs ever existed?
Oh, tell me more.
It just doesn't make sense. I mean, whenever they seem to find bones, they're like, here's one bone, and then they, recreate what they think it looked like when there's like no proof, or it could have been a really large cow bone, or all sorts of things like that. Would it really make sense for dinosaurs to have existed? That's what I'm asking you. Would it have made sense?
Yeah.
No. Religiously.
Oh, from a theological perspective, there's no reason for dinosaurs to exist, and for a long time, people believed that it was a hoax.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a hoax,
from a
but
scientific
I do think
standpoint,
there's got to be another explanation.
You think?
Yes.
So, what you're saying is you're calling into question whether or not dinosaurs existed.
Right.
Oh boy.
What?
Okay. I don't know if we want to open that can of worms.
I have to wait for that one.
Or do we want to have a mini episode on
that sounds like fun.
all of the scientific proof or lack of proof?
Or lack of proof, yeah.
For the dinosaurs. I'm willing to be proven wrong.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I am on this particular issue.
We'll see.
But we'll see. I mean, after all, Dr. Dino has made an entire career. Kent Hovind has made an entire career on trying to prove that the dinosaurs existed during mankind's existence.
And Sam Neill.
I don't know Sam Neill.
Oh, he was in Jurassic Park.
Oh, yeah. Wait. He was a fictitious character from Jurassic Park?
Maybe.
Okay.
But he seemed smart.
We're really off the rails here. All right, so it sounds like next week we're going to get into the nitty-gritty on Noah.
Yeah, I mean, that should be chapter 7.
Yeah, chapter 7.
I know there's a few things in chapter 6 we're going to want to touch on, but it's mainly chapter 7 is where we're going to be starting at.
Yeah, I think 7 and 8 really have a lot of the meat and potatoes that we want to talk about in terms of the dates, the timelines, some of the really interesting parallels between the flood story in the Bible and the Mesopotamian and Babylonian flood stories, like the sacrifices made post-flood, how the birds were sent out, different things like that. So we're definitely going to want to touch that. Even the structure of the ark. We didn't really get into the structure of the ark this week, just barely touched on it, but even the instructions for making the ark seem to have some parallels in the ancient Near Eastern literature.
Oh.
So certainly it'd be worthwhile to at least do a brief 5-minute rundown of the commonalities that we see. That would certainly this would lead most people to believe that there seems to be a retelling of these already existing stories. Yeah.
And I heard that they found the ark on Mount Ararat or something.
Yeah, so that didn't happen, but so there's a never-ending flood. See what I did there of bad archaeology that gets on the internet, especially from an old explorer. I think his last name was Wyatt, who claimed to have found chariots at the bottom of the the Red Sea, so on and so forth. And he also had dubious claims about the ark. Nevertheless, maybe we should actually address those next week. Anyone interested? I mean, you're welcome just to YouTube or Google ark found on Mount Ararat and see all of the National Enquirer level of proof that the ark has been found. But I personally am not persuaded, so we can touch on that next week.
I want to be persuaded.
I understand that. Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. I mean, I tend to be the Debbie Downer here. My job really is to be as skeptical as possible, but I mean, I want to believe the stories. We wouldn't be here right now if I didn't. The question for me personally is whether I want to believe or not. Are they actually believable?
Right.
And on that front, I just have to go with my honest opinion and not what I want.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we're going to end it now. Please like and subscribe if you have questions about this particular topic or the upcoming flood narrative and some of the details in that. Please let us know. We'll try to answer any questions. Maybe we'll be able to take some of the more difficult ones and do like a whole episode just on some specific questions.
Yeah, like a mailbag episode.
Yeah, we really should. We should do a mailbag episode where we've done a lot of overviews, and we kind of have to do that because we're moving through like the entire Bible. But there are probably some episodes we're just going to have to dedicate to doing a deep dive on one or two particular issues.
Yeah.
So let us know questions you have. We'll take your questions very seriously, even if they seem to be silly questions. There are no silly questions.
Yeah, I just asked about the dinosaurs.
Right. I agree. So, whatever is tickling your brain, let us know.
Yep.
All right, until next time, read your Bible.
Oh, I'm supposed to.
We're going to do the thing where we go out and do the outro.
Okay, let's try that again.
All right, from the top.
All right.
Oh, yeah. Until next time, read your Bible.
Oh, I was supposed to. No, we were both supposed to say that.
Oh, right, yeah.
Okay. On three.
Right, one, two, three.
Until next time,
read your Bible.
And, wait, what's my line? Ask questions? Something like that? Oh, ask critical questions.
Right.
That doesn't sound right.
Let's do it one more time.
Okay.
Until next time, don't forget,
next time,
read your Bible.
And ask questions critically. I don't actually know what my line is. I forgot.
Be a critical Christian.
Be a critical Christian.
Nailed it.
Got
it.